Paul McCartney never imagined that the calm, familiar world he built with the Beatles could be shaken by the silent arrival of one woman. Yet the moment Yoko Ono stepped into their inner circle, something shifted. The studio that once felt like a sanctuary for four brothers suddenly carried a weight he could not explain, a tension that clung to every unfinished lyric and every worn piano key. To the public, Yoko appeared quiet, curious, almost gentle. But to Paul, her presence cut through the room with a force he felt long before he understood it. He tried to keep smiling, tried to stay focused on the music that had carried them from Liverpool basements to global stages. Still, the truth lingered in the corners of his mind. Every session grew tighter, every conversation shorter, until even his patience, the patience that held the band together through years of chaos, began to crack. Fans only saw fragments of the story, but inside those walls Paul faced a reality he could not escape. Because in those final Beatles years there was one person he struggled with more than anyone else: Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney always believed the Beatles' strength came from a shared language, a rhythm of understanding built long before fame ever found them. They had lived through the cramped halls of the Cavern Club, the sleepless nights in Hamburg, the exhaustion of global tours. They knew each other's tempers, fears, and quiet hopes. So when 1968 arrived, Paul expected that familiar unity to guide them through the next chapter. Yet everything changed the morning John Lennon walked into the studio with Yoko Ono sitting beside him, not as a guest, but as a partner in every sense. To Paul, it felt like the opening notes of a song played in the wrong key. He had no personal hatred for Yoko, and decades later he would openly acknowledge her importance in John's life. But in that moment, he felt something slipping, something delicate and irreplaceable. The Beatles had always worked in private circles, just the four of them. No wives or girlfriends in the room. It wasn't a rule, it was respect. It kept their creative world balanced, protected from the noise of the outside. Now that world had someone new inside it, someone who had never shared their past, their jokes, their scars. Paul tried to stay professional. He focused on harmonies, arrangements, the details that kept their music alive. Yet he noticed the small disruptions. During takes, John leaned toward Yoko for whispered exchanges. During breaks, she offered suggestions on songs still forming in Paul's mind. None of it was hostile, none of it dramatic. It was simply different, and that difference unsettled him. What once felt like a four-way conversation now felt like a three-way conversation with a fifth voice just slightly out of sync. Not wrong, just unexpected. Still, Paul carried the weight of responsibility. He had been the one pushing the band forward since Brian Epstein's death in 1967. He scheduled rehearsals, organized projects, tried to keep everyone's spirits from slipping into the quiet fog that grief had left behind. But as his leadership grew stronger, so did John's need for independence. Yoko became his creative refuge, the person he trusted most, the person he wanted beside him every moment. For Paul, it felt like watching a lifelong friendship shift into unfamiliar territory, a place he was not invited to follow. The tension did not come from cruelty, it came from loss, the slow unraveling of something sacred. Paul missed the John who stayed late in the studio, shaping melodies with him until the sun rose. He missed their wordless connection, their ability to finish each other's musical thoughts. Now those moments were fading, replaced by long pauses, quiet disagreements, and a growing awareness that their paths were no longer aligned. Fans would later argue about who caused the strain, but the truth was far more human. Paul was not angry at Yoko as a person, he was grieving the space she occupied, the space where his partnership with John once lived. He felt the floor shifting beneath him, not because of her presence alone, but because of what it symbolized: change, separation, the beginning of the end. By the time the sessions for the White Album deepened, Paul already sensed the fracture. He wondered if the bond that survived a decade of chaos could survive this new dynamic, And yet one question lingered, shaping every hour he spent beside them. If this was only the beginning, how much more would the music, the friendship, and the band itself be tested? Paul McCartney walked into the Twickenham studios during the early days of the Let It Be rehearsals with a familiar mix of hope and determination. He believed the Beatles could still find their rhythm, even after the strain of the White Album. The cameras hummed softly, the lights felt cold, and the room itself seemed uneasy, as if it remembered the arguments before the music ever began. Yet Paul held on to the belief that they could still reclaim what they had lost, if they could only find their footing. Except this time, something fundamental was different. Yoko Ono sat beside John, not at the edges, not as a silent observer, but directly in the heart of their once private circle. Paul respected relationships, he respected commitment, but he could feel the shift instantly. What had once been a four-way conversation was now a triangle with an anchor he could not predict. Each comment he made, every suggestion he offered, seemed to pass through an invisible filter. John listened, but somehow from a distance. His attention drifted, not out of boredom, but because Yoko was his constant point of focus. She was his center, and Paul had never seen him devote that much energy to anyone inside the studio before. The atmosphere thickened as days went on. Cameras captured quiet disagreements, clipped responses, and the heavy truth that they were no longer moving as one. Paul tried to lighten the mood, guiding arrangements, shaping melodies the way he always had, but the responses felt colder, shorter. Even George Harrison sensed the strain, later describing the sessions as joyless, a place where creativity struggled to breathe. Paul could feel that grief too. The same room that once echoed with laughter and inside jokes now held the weight of unspoken frustration. Yoko's presence wasn't the sole reason for tension, but it was a constant reminder that the old Beatles world was fading. She sat beside John through every rehearsal, sometimes offering ideas, sometimes performing experimental vocal pieces in the middle of sessions intended for structured songwriting. None of it was wrong. None of it was malicious. It was simply foreign to the rhythm Paul had known for more than a decade. He felt a growing ache for the days when he and John worked instinctively, side by side, chasing melodies with the ease of childhood friends. The group tried to push forward. They attempted unity, attempted patience, but Paul could see the truth forming before any of them admitted it aloud. John was drifting, following a new artistic path that Paul could not join. Their partnership, the partnership that shaped the soundtrack of an entire generation, was thinning like a thread stretched too far. And every moment that thread tightened, Paul felt a deeper sense of loss. Yet even in the quiet unraveling, there were moments of reflection. Paul knew Yoko was not the villain so many wanted her to be. She was simply the person John loved most, the person who offered him a new kind of artistic freedom. The real conflict lived not between Paul and Yoko, but between Paul and the truth he never wanted to confront. The Beatles were no longer four young men pulling in the same direction. They were four individuals moving toward different futures. By the end of those winter sessions, Paul could no longer pretend. Something precious was slipping beyond his reach, and if this was only the middle of their unraveling, what would the final break look like when the music finally stopped? Paul McCartney always believed that music could heal the cracks between them, but by the time the Beatles stepped into Apple Corps to continue their work, he sensed that the distance between himself and John Lennon had grown into something deeper than creative frustration. It was personal, it was emotional, and it was rooted in a shift he had never anticipated. Yoko Ono was now John's constant partner, his collaborator, his sounding board for every new idea. Paul understood devotion, he admired loyalty, but he could not ignore the quiet truth that their once effortless partnership had become something fragile and unfamiliar. There had been a time when Paul and John moved like two halves of a single creative force. They sat knee to knee in small rooms, trading melodies like secrets, finishing one another's phrases without thinking. Their friendship was the spine of the Beatles' story. But in 1969, as Apple's office hummed with tension and legal confusion, Paul watched John create a new artistic identity with Yoko at the center of it. Their experimental albums, Unfinished Music No. 1 and No. 2, revealed a side of John that Paul could not follow. It was personal expression turned into sound, raw emotion pressed onto tape. Paul respected it, but he could feel himself slipping out of John's inner world. During business meetings, John arrived with Yoko beside him, her quiet presence radiating a confidence that Paul struggled to interpret. She took part in conversations about the band's future, offering perspectives that challenged the way Paul had always handled decisions. It wasn't confrontation, it wasn't hostility. It was a new dynamic, and Paul, who had worked for years to keep the band steady after Brian Epstein's death, found himself no longer guiding the group with the same certainty. Every suggestion felt questioned. Every instinct felt weighed against a different voice. The truth was simple and painful. Paul wasn't fighting Yoko, he was fighting the erosion of something sacred. He saw John choosing independence, choosing artistic freedom, choosing a life with Yoko that didn't include the automatic presence of the Beatles. And even though Paul cared deeply for his oldest friend, he couldn't shake the ache that grew each time John deferred to Yoko's opinions instead of turning to him the way he once had. Yet Paul never lashed out publicly. He never called Yoko names, never blamed her directly, never disrespected her. Instead, he buried his frustration beneath a calm exterior, speaking carefully, reasoning quietly, hoping that time would restore what felt lost. He understood love. He understood the pull of a person who inspires your soul, and he knew Yoko meant that to John. But understanding did not soften the feeling of displacement. He felt like a guest in a partnership he once helped build. Inside the studio, the fracture became undeniable. John and Yoko moved as one unit, making music, making decisions, shaping plans for their future activism and artistic projects. Paul stood beside them, offering ideas, offering melodies, still giving everything he had to keep the group alive. But a group cannot breathe when its heart has split into different rhythms, and Paul, who once found joy in every shared chord with John, now felt the weight of every silence between them. Still, beneath the tension, Paul carried a deeper question he never voiced aloud. If the partnership that defined his life was fading, what would happen to the music that held the world together? And more painfully, could he hold on to the friend he loved, even as the band they built in their youth began slipping away from both of them? The music never stopped, but the business of the Beatles began to weigh heavier than any melody. Paul McCartney, who had spent years trying to keep the band afloat after Brian Epstein's death in 1967, suddenly found himself navigating not just creative tensions, but financial and managerial crises. The formation of Apple Corps was meant to be a dream realized, a company where the band could control its own destiny. Instead, it became a mirror of their divisions, reflecting differences they could no longer ignore. And at the heart of many of these disagreements stood John Lennon and Yoko Ono, moving through meetings as a unit, advocating for decisions that Paul could not always support. In 1969, the question of management became the central battleground. John, George, and Ringo chose Alan Klein to manage the Beatles' affairs. Paul had other plans. He wanted the Eastmans, his in-laws, to oversee the business, believing their guidance would be more trustworthy and transparent. Yoko's influence was visible throughout this process. She was present during discussions, offering insight and supporting John's decisions, reinforcing his choice of Klein. To Paul, it felt as if the scales had shifted without warning, and the person he had always turned to for guidance, John, now saw the world through a lens colored by Yoko's presence. Paul did not react with anger. He did not lash out or speak in public condemnation. Instead, he measured every word, planned every conversation carefully, and tried to protect the unity of the band through reason and patience. He knew the stakes were immense. These decisions would affect not just their livelihoods, but the trust and history they had built over a decade. Still, as meetings stretched on, he felt the quiet isolation of being outvoted, a silent witness to choices he believed endangered the group's stability. The conflict was never about Yoko personally. It was about what she represented, a shift in dynamics, a partner whose voice had weight, whose presence demanded recognition. Paul saw John leaning into that partnership, trusting her judgment, and in subtle ways, deferring to her authority. It was a new form of influence he had never encountered, one that intertwined love, loyalty, and professional decision-making. He observed quietly, measured and considered, but the sensation of being sidelined was unmistakable. The legal tension reached its apex when Paul filed a lawsuit in late 1970 to formally dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. He cited managerial disputes and the necessity to protect the band's future. John and Yoko, supportive of Klein, accepted this course with less resistance. The process was slow, tedious, and emotionally draining. Each meeting reminded Paul that the band he had helped guide through fame, grief, and artistic evolution was fracturing in ways he could not fully control. Yet even in these moments, Paul carried a sense of responsibility. He focused on maintaining professionalism, protecting friendships where possible, and ensuring the music they created would survive the storm of disagreements. He understood that Yoko's influence on John was not a weapon, but a reflection of their personal bond and shared vision. And he also understood that history would remember the decisions, but not the quiet labor, the emotional endurance, and the subtle negotiations that preserved the integrity of the music, and ultimately, of their shared legacy. By the end of this period, Paul knew the fractures were deeper than melodies or harmonies. Business, creativity, and love had collided in a way that demanded navigation he had never been taught, and he faced it with the same patience and reflection that had guided him through the Beatles' entire career. But the emotional weight of watching the band's world tilt, quietly and inexorably, would stay with him for decades. Years passed, but the echoes of those final Beatles sessions never fully left Paul McCartney. Time softened the edges of tension, but it did not erase memory. He often reflected on the years when the music they made together felt overshadowed by distance, by disagreements, and by the presence of a woman who had become inseparable from John Lennon's world. Yoko Ono was no longer the disruption he had felt in 1968 and 1969. She had become, in Paul's eyes, a partner to John's creativity and life, a presence he could respect even when it reminded him of what he had once lost. Paul and Yoko's relationship evolved slowly, not through dramatic reconciliations, but through shared reverence for John's legacy. In the decades following John's death in 1980, Paul collaborated with Yoko on memorial projects, including tributes and performances honoring Lennon's music. He attended events with her blessing and consulted her when revisiting John's compositions. These moments were small, quiet, and human, but they carried immense significance. Paul's respect for Yoko had grown through experience, reflection, and the recognition that she had been part of a creative journey that mattered profoundly to John. In interviews throughout the 80s and 90s, Paul described his feelings carefully. He clarified that Yoko was not to blame for the Beatles' breakup, and that the tensions in the studio had arisen from a combination of personal growth, artistic exploration, and the complex evolution of their friendships. He spoke about Yoko as someone who loved John, supported his creativity, and helped him navigate a world that none of them could have anticipated in their youth. For Paul, the challenge was no longer opposition, but understanding, a patient, reflective acknowledgement of the bonds that had shaped history. The two found common ground in their shared commitment to preserving John's legacy. Paul respected her influence on his friend, and Yoko acknowledged Paul's role in the Beatles' enduring music. Their interactions were professional yet warm, a testament to the passage of time and the capacity of human relationships to transform. Paul performed songs tied to John's memory with her consent, and they spoke about music, art, and history in a spirit of cooperation. The friction of the past became tempered by mutual purpose, turning what had once been a source of unease into a quiet acknowledgement of shared stewardship. Paul also reflected on the personal lessons from those years. He recognized that emotions he had once interpreted as anger or displacement were in truth feelings of loss, of a creative partnership that could not remain as it once was. Yoko was not an obstacle. She was part of John's life, inseparable from the inspiration he needed. And so Paul's admiration for her grew alongside the enduring love he carried for his friend. The strain that had once defined their interactions evolved into clarity, respect for each other, acknowledgement of their roles, and gratitude for the music that had survived all trials. Even now, decades later, Paul speaks of Yoko with careful warmth. He remembers the difficulties of the past, the quiet moments of tension in Applecore and the Twickenham studios, and he acknowledges the human realities that shaped every decision, every emotion, and every note they recorded. He understands that history will always tell a story of friction, but he also knows the truth that through patience, reflection, and respect, even the deepest divides can find a measure of harmony, and in that understanding lies a quiet, enduring redemption, one that honors friendship, music, and the human capacity to forgive. The story of Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono is not one of hatred, but of transformation. It is a tale of friendships tested, of creative bonds stretched to their limits, and of the quiet endurance required to honor both art and affection. Paul, who once struggled with the presence of Yoko in the Beatles' inner world, came to understand the depth of her partnership with John Lennon. He recognized that the tension he felt was rooted not in malice, but in the shifting dynamics of love, loyalty, and artistic vision. Over the years, that initial discomfort evolved into respect. Paul collaborated with Yoko on memorials, consulted her regarding John's music, and acknowledged her influence openly in interviews. The lessons of patience, reflection, and understanding became as important as the music they had once made together. Through it all, Paul never lost sight of the friendship and the creative magic that had defined a generation. Even now, when he speaks of those years, there is warmth, clarity, and the quiet knowledge that some divides can transform into harmony. Their story reminds us that human relationships, like music, demand time, care, and a willingness to listen. For more emotional stories, check out this video.